Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak today about our chapter. So I just want to acknowledge, obviously, Zoe, the wonderful Zoe, was my co-author of the chapter, and really was privileged to work with her and with Nicole and Heather to develop our chapter and be part of this amazing project. We chose a family law judgment as we've both previously written, we co-written about notions of culture and connection in family law proceedings, and so we deliberately chose our family law judgment. Our case involved an Aboriginal woman, so an Aboriginal mother and two fathers, one non-Indigenous and one Indigenous father, and I think 6 children, 5 were the subject of the proceedings. And at times the parties lived in large regional towns in New South Wales and in Sydney as well at times. So there's kind of that contemporary notion. When we look at culture in that contemporary context and how the law sees that or deals with that or views that. We did stick within rewriting the judgment. The law. The family law system does have a mechanism for cultural connection and reflecting that. So we wrote within the judgment and rewrote that judgment because I think on first reading it straight away you could see that this woman's story was missing from the judgment. It just was not there. Her story, her lived experience was missing. That's what was really clear to us. We did in our first draft send it to a very esteemed writer who is not a lawyer, and she wrote back very succinctly that it was just racist from her read of the judgment that she had a look at. It was so clearly the story missing from what we all know as a lived experience of an Aboriginal woman in this country in this contemporary setting. And so we in writing the judgment, and dissecting some of the previous. So we wrote the appeal judgment. There were some other previous judgments as well. We looked at all of them, had the benefit of writing our appeal judgment, and it really highlighted for us the challenge that First Nations people still have in this legal system in having our voices heard and our stories heard to get what you see as justice in the system. So. And even though, as I said, there's legislation and case law that actually does guide the family law system in doing that, in doing just that. So, so in the family law system, we have law that says an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander child's connection to their culture must be considered. The first sort of iteration of that came in 1996. So still fairly slow in the course of time, but in 1996 was the first time that was included, that culture was a factor in determining the child's best interests. And then in 2006, some more changes were made to the legislation to give us greater guidance around, we'll give courts greater guidance around what that should look like in terms of culture and cultural connection. And it is so important for our community for that to be in there, and a lot of work and advocacy was done over a long time to get those reforms, because we know that culture and connection to culture is fundamental to a child's identity and to their long-term well-being. And so those changes really, I think, came at a time with the Bringing Them Home report, which really highlighted that as well, that really importance to connection to culture and what that means for children and families and communities. So that law is there, and there's also some jurisprudence that's really relevant as well. B&R was the case in 1995 that was really clear about not just connection in this kind of vague notion of culture, but they talk about it, the reality of the lived experience of an Aboriginal person, Aboriginal people. So, and really gave guidance to judges as well about how to do that and what their knowledge should be in making these decisions, what their own knowledge and what expertise they might draw on to be able to make their judgments. So we read this judgment and thought, well, that's missing. That's so much of this woman's story is just not in here, and what we know about life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The court really did miss the point in the judgment. The culture was discussed by various parties, by the judges during the proceedings, by the lawyers, by the family report writer. They also culture is important, and they didn't go any further in terms of what does that actually mean for this person in a contemporary context. And so they saw her as having no culture, or lacking in culture, and yet we've got this colonial process that has made her end up in that point as well. That's all impacted but forgotten in the story and just missed in the judgment. So it was really important for us to try and draw out her story, to try and point out the things that were missing that actually are cultural strengths, her connections with the mum's connection with her own family and sisters. You know, those sisters, the aunties of the children, are kind of mothers of the children in our culture. That was all missed as well. And so there are actually orders for them not to have any connection at all with some of them for some concerns around risk. But without unpacking all of that and understanding the relationships and those relationships between all the children as well, it was just an injustice. So ultimately, the decision was that by the end of the appeal, this mother has none of the children in her care. The children are split between the two different fathers, and her time with them is limited and never with the children together either. So, you know, clearly some fundamental misunderstandings about our culture and the cultural strengths, and even the child rearing practices as well. That just seems to be missing by our child rearing practice. So the view of her as not engaging in the way that through that white lens would be was seen as being deficient then in the way that she parented and raised her kids. So we really, in our commentary, talked about that, you know, contemporary urban. Our culture's not going to be static, and it's going to be dynamic and different, and will vary from family to family, community to community as well. So it's what then judges and the system needs to do to be able to respond to that. What's the good of law is not if it's not diverse, not if there's not diversity in the profession, in the policymakers, in the legislature, in judges. You know, we're not going to hear our stories. We're not going to hear and view through that lens in the judgments that we see. Same, I think, with and we did run out of time in our judgment with the word limit and the tough editors, of being able to go fully too into the family violence. There was some, and the way that the mother's reporting of incidents downplayed the seriousness of her, and the red flags that you can spot when you read the judgment and you have a look at what she's reporting were not taken seriously as well in the judgment. So it's really that family violence as well from our reading of it was also not done. And that's the lack of voice, the lack of women's voices, the lack of First Nations voices, you know, has then that ultimate impact on families, communities, and children. So that's really where we went with our judgment. I think the good of law, the family law system has been responsive after years and years of advocacy to some extent, but slowly. You know, it's slow, and if it's not delivered in a way that is meaningful and doesn't hear our voices, don't have systems to do that, then it's not good. It's not good at all for us. So I think that it really, when we reflect on it, we did make some recommendations about the system, the changes to the system, that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander family consultants that used to be in the court were taken out of the court and just now being put back into the court. You know, we made some recommendations about those programs and how they really can help to have people involved in the system and heard in the way that they should be. The issue of family report writers is another, and I know Zoe's doing a lot more research in that field as well, because that also is where our stories are lost. It's imposing this system of gathering information that's not culturally appropriate, it's not comfortable. And I will finish with a Torres Strait Islander woman that I've worked with that anyone would see as being cultural and connected, was asked by the family report writer to explain her culture. She came back to see us and said, I don't know what that means. It's what I live, it's how I live, and it just is what it is. It's what we do. And she couldn't explain it. And so you can imagine for the court, the report writer puts a report that says, well, she can't really explain the culture, and that's not really that important, is it? You know, so that's always sort of, her story is just such a good example of what we're talking about and how it just can be so easily missed. And that's why I think it was really important for both of us to be able to write this judgment and rewrite and reimagine a family law judgment with doing that in the way that it is, I think, for all intents and purposes, meant to be done with the legislation that we've got and the case law guidance that we've got. Thank you.